Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Pedagogy Non Grata. I know been a while since we've done an episode, and truthfully, that's just because I've been enjoying my summer vacation and doing some renovation projects. I've got Nicola Lott here with me today, and we're going to be talking about the science of reading, reading intervention, and split speech to print. I'm really excited to have her on the podcast today. And before I say anything else is wrong, I'd just like her to introduce herself to the audience.
Oh, well, hello. It's lovely to be here. I've been a long time fan of pedagogy non grata ever since Dr. Catherine Garforth recommended that I listen to an episode, and I've just loved it ever since. I was originally an Orton Gillingham practitioner. I was chair of OG Canada for 4 years, and I've just really moved into the space of science of reading, supporting inclusive education in schools, kind of in that kind of space between um, supporting diverse learners in Tier 1 and supporting interventionists working to help those kids be successful in Tiers 2 and 3. And that's kind of my area of passion. I just graduated with a master's from UBC in special education in May. And that was kind of the area that I was really working on was inclusive education and how it dovetails with science of reading. I have a real thing, as you mentioned, for speech to print, but I'm also kind of not, what's the word? I'm a little agnostic. Like I love both ways. Like I think there's space for both in this world. So yeah,
That's
that's
really
a
great
little
to hear.
bit about who I am.
I've been kind of pioneering this term a little bit in my head of scientifically agnostic on education. And I just mean to say that, people are so quick to put themselves in a camp. And I love to hear that people are like, well, my mind's not made up, or, I'll change my mind as evidence comes out, or I'm open to trying new things. I think the worst thing we can do is be like, I'm a SOR teacher and this is the SOR approach, or I'm an Orton Gillingham teacher, or a reading recovery teacher, or a speech to print teacher, because I feel like you're putting yourself in this box, and I don't know that that's healthy. But I think people we love to just give ourselves identities, to just hold on to. So you said I was an Orton Ham Gillingham instructor. Are you still using an Orton Ham Gillingham approach? And if
That
not, what are you
that
doing now?
is the million-dollar question, I'd say. Because again, like I'm a real nerd. I love to follow research. And so everything that is evidence-based is embedded in everything I do. And so I'd say, and if you look at the guiding principles of Orton Gillingham, I follow them all, absolutely. Um, I don't follow some of the I guess dogma that has grown in around Orton Gillingham that hasn't been found to be evidence-based. And so I think in some circles they would describe me as not OG anymore. But actually, if you look at kind of like really what if you look at the founding principles of OG, there's there's no reason why you wouldn't call me OG. So I don't know. At this point in time, I'm still trying to decide where I'm at with that.
I really want to dive deeper into that. That's really interesting. So I have like five follow-up questions ready. So what are the principles of Orton Gillingham in your mind? You were the chair for Canada, so you must know what the
Yeah,
principles are.
yeah. Actually, we sat down and redefined them because OG Canada is a separate organization to other Orton Gillingham organizations, and we really wanted to create a Canadian identity for the organization and really kind of be looking at kind of our guiding light and our guiding principles. And so we went back to, you know, what some of the different writings were on Orton Gillingham, going back to Samuel Orton, and created this kind of schema, which you can find on their website, OG Canada's website, actually. The very lovely Michelle McIntosh did an incredible infographic that kind of puts it all together, but it really takes the structured literacy principles and then adds a couple more pillars in on the how you would teach, right? So where structured literacy is like explicit, systematic, cumulative. I'm not going to be able to remember them all off the top of my head, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Orton Gillingham is more of the like, we do it multisensorily, we do it with the one of the ones we put in for the OG Canada one was we do it from a socially emotionally respectful place that works with the child. Yeah, I don't have them all on the top of my head, but that's
Okay.
that's the gist of it. The structured literacy is the what and the OG is the how.
Yeah. So if I'm being honest, and I always hate defining approaches and programs and philosophies because anytime I do, there's someone who comes at me on social media, either Twitter or Facebook, who says, your definition is wrong. It's this definition. But unfortunately, there's often multiple definitions floating around there, and we'll fight about what is the true definition. I think sometimes we got to get at just sort of the spirit of what something is, rather than worrying about the preciseness of the philosophy, because it's really hard to pin down what some of these things are exactly because they seem to mean different things to different people. Case in point, balanced literacy. I had a group of 7 people and we tried to agree on a definition of balanced literacy and we couldn't do it actually.
Good luck.
Uh, yeah, it was a completely fruitless task, although I did learn a lot about it from it.
I I think the more you know about anything, the less you can define it. Like you just become more and more aware of the nuances, and it's just like just becomes more of a headache.
Yeah. Now, personally, I kind of view Orton Gillingham as being a systematic phonics program or a structured literacy program that also includes multisensory instruction, typically includes syllable instruction, handwriting instruction, and typically follows a mastery path of students are taught phoneme, grapheme, correspondences until they reach mastery of those. Would you say that's fair, or am I off on anything?
I'd say you're fair, other than I would take the word program out because OG is an approach, not a program. So
That's fair.
there's programs that are based on OG, like
Yeah.
Wilson and Slingerland and Barton, but OG is more like I always think about it in terms of like Italian cooking is a style of cooking, whereas the spaghetti factory is a specific way, like they'll give you specific recipes. This is how we interpret Italian cooking. So when you train as an OG, you learn the approach, kind of like Montessori or Reggio or something like that. And then so there's no program, and that's a piece that I've been kind of working I'm advocating for is for actually for OGs to start to use more of the programs that are available instead of recreating the wheel all the time, which is, I think, burning a lot of people out.
Yeah, you know what? I have a love-hate with programs because personally, I've made and sell a program to be honest, full disclosure, but um, kind of hate programs naturally just because I don't like to be told what to do. Like that's just me. But at the same time, I have to admit that they're useful, and some people like using them, and I think they can be useful in that, as you say, not everyone wants to start from scratch and make all of their lessons on their own. And I think they're especially useful for beginner teachers. We have a lot of people are trying to make that transition to structured literacy or a science of reading approach, as you want to call it. Having, resources that are pre-made for them is a heck of a lot easier than being like, okay, now go write your own phonics scope and sequence, create the decodables to go with it, etc. That's a lot task an individual teacher to do.
I'd kind of like to get the data, but because I don't have it and I don't know that it's available, but I think there's a problem with people getting burned out because they're like, oh, I can't use worksheets. Oh,
Mm,
I'm above that, right? Like and there's this sort of feeling of if you're in the photocopy room photocopying worksheets, you're not doing your job properly. And the reality is, and I hear you, like programs can be pretty awful, especially when they're like completely scripted, and you're like,
oh
hang on
yeah.
a second, I've got to, and then we are, like it can be awful, but done well, they can be good. Um, but the good thing about a program is if you find one that's got some evidence behind it, you can start with a platform that has been shown to work, and then you can
Hold
use
on.
the um, NCII protocol on intensifying an intervention and see if it's not working for the kid. Now you're going, okay, I'm going to change one variable. Okay, now that did that work or not? I'm going to change another variable. So you're starting from a really stable place if you are. But you know, one of the benefits of working in private practice is I get to choose what program I want to use. So I don't get
Yeah,
them
it's
put
great.
on me.
I have like there's definitely research showing that scripted programs can work. But I've also been in classrooms where, as a teacher, I've been asked to follow a scripted program, and I just feel like they're soul sucking. It's
I
just something
have
about being
one.
told to read from a script, and you're like, I am
Oh,
not a monkey, not a
I
robot.
can't do it. I can't actually physically do it and focus on
Me
what I'm
neither.
teaching at the same time. Some of the programs I do really like give you kind of like an outline and then say, you know, here, pick one of these three activities, and here's how you sort of make them harder. Here's how you make them easier. And you just, after a while, you're doing the stuff, but you're not having to think about it.
Yeah, I mean, even my own program, I designed it to be as non-scripted as possible, so teachers could more just use the resources as they feel fit. And I've actually been thinking I'd like to create a scripted version for teachers who aren't like me, who don't enjoy improvising. But yeah, I don't know. I see the argument both ways. So you said was an Orton Gillingham teacher, was an Orton Gillingham instructor. Um, so where do you feel like you've broken off a little, and what caused that?
Um, well, so there's a few studies that have come out that because I'm a research nerd, I've really kind of delved into some certain areas and I've just left them behind. So I'm not a big fan of syllable instruction for that reason. Not a big fan of the tracing. This is the big one,
Mm,
probably. The tracing the letters if you don't get them right, or just tracing the letters. There was a study. Please don't ask me to tell you who wrote it off the top of my head, but I can tell you afterwards. That where they actually compared students who did multisensory explicit instruction. Sorry, not multisensory, but just explicit science reading instruction with students who did a multisensory like tracing and intervention. So two interventions exactly the same essentially, except one of them was tracing and one of them wasn't. And what they found at the end of it was both did better than the control, which just did the, you know, as usual. Um, but the one that did the without the tracing, it took them less time. So you got to ask yourself if tracing's not giving you an even greater lift and it's taking time, instructional time, is it worth it? So
yeah,
yeah,
I
interesting
think that's
study.
the one that is the multi-sensory component has always been the part of Orton and Gillingham that I'm most skeptical of. It's not so much that I think it's harmful. It's just that I tend to hypothesize that it's probably a low value practice and just that it doesn't add anything to the instruction. That would just be my guess, but
So
it's
I've
not a lot
done
of
a
research
lot
on it.
of, I did like a bit of a deep dive into multisensory instruction in general. And there is like, there's about 50% of the studies find that it's effective and 50% say it's not effective. So it's really kind of like what's working here and what isn't working here. There's definitely something there for sure. Is it, I know Shanahan wrote a blog post on it and he said, is it working because of it, the multi-sensory component, or is it working because it's just engaging kids?
Yeah.
And that's kind of how I've found that it is helpful is you know when you're doing it kind of like, well, when you make a mistake we do this repetitive thing, then that tends to shut kids down. But when you are doing something that is engaging them or really specifically like connecting speech to print, like sounding as you're writing, that does seem to have a really big impact. So I'd say play with it. Don't write it off, but it isn't the golden bullet either.
Yeah. I had a conversation a long time ago with Rebecca Miles, and shout out to her. And she had a good point on it. And she said she feels like it's probably there for engagement, um, but that she feels like sometimes Orton Hemgilling instructors, and I believe she does use an Orton Hemgilling approach. I could be wrong. I might get an earful from her if I got this wrong, but Um, she said something to the fact that she feels like sometimes instructors get so carried away with it. They get so into that dogma, as you were talking about earlier, of multisensory is important. And I think sometimes there's even a magical thinking that happens about multisensory. Oh, multiple senses were engaged, automatically learning increased, which I'm highly skeptical of. Uh, but you can get so fixated on that the purpose of the lesson can become multisensory and components rather than trying to teach phonics, say. And I feel like it's got to be a means to an end if it is working. It can't be the end goal in itself.
And again, it has to be, you think like if you're taking extra time to do it, it better be giving you like a real bang for your buck, right? So yeah,
I got to admit, the shading cream and the scented marker stuff that really. So, so
I have
I
done
sorry, I
that.
shouldn't be so dismissive, but I'm very skeptical of it.
I've done that when the shaving cream I've done many times, and I've done it when, we've tried everything else. Let's just have a bit of fun and let's practice this letter, whatever it is, and let's just do it in a more fun way. But yeah, I wouldn't write multisensory off, but you
I think
gotta you gotta factor it in as time as well.
I think it's a fair thing to say though too, to be like, well, I tried everything else. I'm not sure how to help this kid in this moment. Let's try this out of the box thing. I spent the last 6 years researching and writing about things for evidence-based. We have all kinds of things in my classroom based on like whims and hypotheses and guesses. It's just everyone's got gut feelings of things that might work, and I think that's fine, just as long as we acknowledge them. I definitely hear people say like all instruction has to be multisensory, or um, if it's not OG, it's not evidence-based. I've seen those comments saying, or that it's the gold standard. And not to say that that represents the entire community, the OG. There's zealots in every community for sure. And
Well,
OG
and
is
I
just one
think
of those communities that has that.
and I think, that's one of the things I do hear is, oh, OG's out of date. And
Mm.
well, what, it's like, how can you say like because there's so many different practitioners, it's an approach, it's not a program. A lot of people say, well, they don't teach phonological awareness yet in OG, and I'm like, really? You think that's true? No, come on. Like, I'm sure maybe there's some trainers out there that are doing that, but it's not one body. It's multiple bodies with multiple ways of doing it. Everybody has their own different flair. So you can't describe the approach with one brush. It's many things to many people. And there's some incredible practitioners out there doing incredible things. And so I'd never want to say anything bad about OG because there's some really good people in that field.
Absolutely. And maybe I've said it comes across like I've been a little harsh on OG here for a second, but I do want to give them their props for two or three things. One, I think um, a lot of what we see as the science reading movement was really started by Orton Gillingham, in that uh, dyslexic tutors who were OG trained were really promoting a structured literacy approach and using evidence-based practices. And I think that really engaged parents. And then I think parents actually became the real lightning rod that sort of really made the science reading movement take off. And I think especially during COVID, people seemed to wake up to what was going on in terms of instruction, and specifically parents of dyslexic kids who saw there's something about this mainstream instruction isn't working, and we need to sort of change this model to be more in line with research evidence. So I think that you definitely got to give that props to OG, and I'll give them another props. And this is just that, this is going back to actually the big paper I think that has criticized OG in terms of research was Stevens' 2021 meta-analysis, which showed it was less effective than the average phonics program. Um, they said in it the majority of the practices that are in OG are evidence-based, and mainly, it's systematic, structured literacy phonics. Like that's what we know works for the most part from the scientific literature. So I do wonder if there's individual components in OG that aren't working, and that's why Stevens 21 found it didn't work as effectively as other phonics programs, or if we just need more research because there's actually only a very small number of studies on Fordham Gillingham instruction directly, and it's about 20 studies,
It's
which is
difficult
hard to draw
because
from.
It's difficult because it's an approach, right? Like, they can
Yeah.
take Wilson. I think there's been a few studies done on Wilson, and they'll, decide how effective is that, but that's not indicative of, OG as a whole. And, it's like saying, is teaching in Ontario evidence-based? Is it effective? Well, every teacher's doing it differently. So, you know, I think
It's hard to say. I get what you're
when
saying.
you look at, because OG was like Samuel Orton's wife created the Orton Foundation, which has then over the years become the IDA, right? It's all very connected, and they've sort of slowly kind of separated themselves from OG, but the two organizations or the two ideas they come from the same place. So the tenets of structured literacy with the knowledge practice standards that were created by the International Dyslexia Association have been fully embodied by OG. So everything that they are doing in OG, so long as they are doing what they're supposed to be doing, which is following those knowledge practice standards, is evidence-based. It's just some of those other practices. And when you train in OG, they work you very hard to become uh, very strict to certain very specific practices. And I guess what I would say is I think we can loosen up a little bit. I think we can allow people to have a little bit more freedom because some of those practices have been taken to be a little bit too rigid, and they may not be.
I
They
think
may
that's a
not be
great point.
evidence-based.
The National Reading Panel, when they did their meta-analysis, one of the findings that I don't think many people talk about is they showed that teachers who fall or studies in which they did not track fidelity actually showed higher results than studies that did track fidelity. So when teachers were like forced to teach the program with fidelity, they actually did worse.
That's
Um,
fascinating.
yeah, that doesn't surprise me if I'm being honest. If you're being told, like, just think of it logically. If you're given a scope and sequence of phonics and it says, "Hey, like, teach this at this time," and I think that's what you should be doing. But at the same time, if you have like an amazing class and they're soaring through a week, I think it's perfectly fine to like, okay, we'll speed up this week and next week we'll have more time. Or if they're really struggling with, let's say controlled R, which is technically a syllable type, but I also see it as a list of graphemes. Um, it might make sense to spend some little extra time on it. I thought kids really struggle with that ER versus that R sound. Um, so many times I've seen kids like see a word like rob and been like rob. You just want to be
Yeah,
like, no, there's no vowel in front. Why are you
yeah,
saying that?
yeah. But you
Um,
know what? I would argue that that is remaining. I don't know what the verb is, fidelis. That's
mm,
keeping with fidelity. That fidelity doesn't say that you're not allowed to, that the program overrides what the kid needs. And that's the ethos of the NCII, the National Center for Intensive Intervention, is use the program as a base, look at what the kids need, modify it based on what the kids need.
yeah, I completely agree. Like, there's no need to be following programs in a slave-like fashion. Um, so another part that I have kind of hypothesized about is the speed of instruction. I've heard from parents of kids who are in OG programs or OG tutoring sometimes complain that the pace of instruction felt really slow. And I've heard some speech to print advocates claim that maybe the mastery-based approach was problematic, that they should be pushing the kids to go through faster rather than worrying about if they've reached complete mastery at that section. Um, and I know Holly Lane in her program, Useful Eye, they use a spiraling method where rather than worrying if they got the graphemes at the end of the week, they check to see, or they just reteach them again in a couple weeks. So I'm curious to what your thoughts are about that.
I think that's a great question, and it's really perceptive to pick it up. So I trained through AOG and OG Canada, so I've kind of seen OG from a couple different perspectives over the years, and I'd say with it being an approach, different people have different ways of doing that. There is definitely that kind of mastery approach. Do not move on until they are getting like 95% accuracy, and if you move on before then you're not doing it right. And then there's another philosophy which really does say you got to keep these kids moving. Like
Yeah.
the train has left the station for their reading and it's accelerating and you got to keep going to catch them up and you got to keep going. It's like they say, and there's a famous OG saying that's like as fast as you can and as slow as you must kind of thing. Like you got to keep going because they're not getting catching up to that train if you don't. And so they do like it with an OG lesson plan. There 50% of the class is just review, so they are getting lots of repetition in it. Um, and what I've seen over the years is different people taking that idea to different lengths. So I see people who are very, committed to the 95% accuracy. And I've found certainly with kids who have ADHD, that's not going to work because you
Mhm.
lost them. By the time they've had to redo something a couple times, they're not even sitting at the table with you in their heads, right? Like they're somewhere else now. So and then so different things for different kids, but over the years, I've been more and more curious about the claims made by speech to print on how fast they can teach kids to read. So for my one of my major projects for my master's, I did a deep dive into the research on the evidence behind some of those claims, and then I've also been using it in my practice as well. And what I'm finding is sort of just from my anecdotal findings is that you can move kids along quite a lot quicker using the speech to print approach. And personally, I think again, the train's left the station. Let's catch them up as quick as possible. So I would I now lean much more towards that going faster place.
Yeah. Um, I wrote an article about 2 years ago on like pace of instruction, and I suggested that research shows that we should be between 3 to 5 letter sounds per week, which is faster than a lot of programs, much to my surprise. But actually, I'm just working on updating that research and reevaluating, and I no longer stand by that because we just don't have enough research on phonics open sequences move significantly faster than that. And in my own personal practice, I have found you can go way faster than 3 to 5 sounds per week. At least in the demographics I teach now, I typically teach older students. So if I'm teaching phonics, it's a struggling reader. But I know at least from the context of older struggling readers, they can definitely do more than 3 or 5 letter sounds per week.
Yeah, so I'd say from my experience, if I'm looking at it from a how many sounds can I teach per week, it can be really variable depending on the kid,
Mm,
depending on
yeah, that makes sense.
how much their learning disability is affecting them. But when I do it from a speech to print perspective, I'm teaching one sound per week, but I might be teaching three graphemes, five graphemes, maybe even more.
I'm talking about letter sound correspondences, to be fair, not sounds. So
But it makes such a
more I'm thinking of like
difference.
graphemes you're teaching, not phonics. But yeah, I agree.
But it makes a big difference because if you teach them, it just seems like everyone, like this is one of the big claims of speech to print is that it works with the way the brain works, right? The way the brain memorizes these things. And I was like, okay, show me the evidence on that claim. So I spent all this time digging into it and I was like, yeah, that's kind of fuzzy. It's true that the brain has these semantic memories and then we map sounds onto them. And then we do seem to map our graphemes onto the sounds, to the sort of phoneme memories. That does seem to be true, but whether that you can only learn, like you learn that much better one way over the other, I still think is a bit of a fuzzy claim, to be honest. But what I found is that does seem to work. When I teach a kid, we're gonna learn E and we learn like five graphemes for E, they get it. But I've tried to then teach them, say, three R controlled vowels, so AR, OR, ER at the same time. Then we spent 3 weeks because they're confused. And I'm like, wow, maybe there is something to that. I can't say for definite, but they do seem to be able to retain more when they're just trying to learn one sound, but more multiple graphemes.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you say that. I have a hypothesis here that I haven't tested, and it's just my theory. I believe that speech to print makes more sense for older students than a print-to-speech approach, but I still like a print-to-speech approach better for younger kids. Um, and hear me out. Yeah, I think because yes, it is easier to do a faster pace, but I think it almost seems to require some base level of knowledge, like some prior knowledge on some basic phonics, to do. Um, and I'll give you an example. Like, let's say I'm teaching, like if you look at the first week of my phonics program for elementary kid students for grade one, it starts off with sat pin. And the reason I start with sat pin is to anyone who's a long time phonics instructor is obvious. It's because there's like over 100 words that have the letters A-T-P-I-N in them. Um, so just by teaching those letters and the sounds commonly associated with that using a print-to-speech approach, I've given them a whole bunch of words that they can read and write and spell within a very short period of time. And I think that's harder to do within a speech-to-print approach. Say if I wanted to say teach the S sound, well, then I might want to show them multiple graphemes to represent that. So then I just think we might spend more time on each individual sound and less time on spelling patterns. And I kind of hypothesize that little kids, they just need more spelling patterns at the start so they can get access to the code and writing and reading faster. So and this is something that I shout out to Katie Gardner, um, who said this to me once, and I tend to agree with her that um, phonics works best when kids know more of it because they have a greater access to words. When you only have a couple of letters, it's hard to conceptualize. Um, it's hard to conceptualize how this can be applied to a greater code. But as more letters you know, the more words you can decode, etc. I think I've done a terrible job explaining that hypothesis, but I'll let you
No, I
debunk it if
kind
you
of
like.
agree. So I'm guilty of probably spending more money on or like stuff to teach with than I've ever earned teaching, pretty much. And I've actually bought three speech to print programs and
Oh,
trained
did
in
you?
two of them. And
I'm
I'm
not
not going
trained
to
in any of them,
name,
to be fair.
I'm not going to name any names. Um, but I have found some of them are better than others at starting kids off. One of the problems I've seen with some speech to print is that it starts very complicated or it starts, you got to teach lots and lots and lots of lessons before you've got enough to really make any sense. Other ones I've seen do it really well. So I'd
Mhm.
say depends on who's doing the speech to print is my answer to that.
That's a good response. The first or introduction I had to it with Dr. Steve Truk. I'm forgetting how to say his name. I can spell it, but I can't pronounce it. It's Truch. But
Yeah,
um,
uh,
he
Trush.
described this approach. Truch, yeah, that might be it. I think it is Truch. He described it as linguistic phonics. He didn't use that term
Yeah.
speech to print. And I think he's right that this is a more linguistically accurate model. And I've heard Lynn Stone criticize speech to print for that linguistic accuracy coming at a cost of being sort of too complicated for younger students, and then also not being as entirely as linguistically accurate as some people portray it to be. It's actually like, truthfully, a morphological approach like structured word inquiry is probably more linguistically accurate than any speech to print approach. But I think I agree with what I'm perceiving Lindstone's argument to be, at least, that linguistic accuracy isn't always necessary. Because sometimes we're dealing with little kids or students with severe learning disabilities. I don't know if we always have to be like teaching them the most linguistically accurate model, and sometimes I think it might be more sensible to just teach them the most pragmatic model. And that's why I say in the very like that very first 10 lessons that a kid has in phonics, I think it's probably easier and simpler to just teach it from a print to speech approach rather than a speech to print.
This is where I become really conflicted because
Okay, I want to hear it.
I'm very much, passionately a supporter of the science of reading, and I look to the research, and I love to hear from the people with the PhDs. I love to hear from speech language pathologists. I love hearing interdisciplinary ideas and thoughts. But then I think, and then I hear these things, and I go like, guys, you're like making this way too complicated. Like, let's bring some teachers in. We know how to do this stuff. Like, we can, that's what we do. And we tend to, I think it's a profession. Yes, this is the conflict, right? Like, we do need to look out to some of these other, um, allied fields. but at the end of the day, we do need to also have confidence in ourselves. We got this. And we do know how to take this really complicated stuff and deliver it in a way that works great for a 5-year-old.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. I think there's definitely some truth to that. I just think too, we can get really bogged down in being linguistically accurate. I've seen some very intense debates on social media about like what is the proper rule for X grapheme phoneme correspondence or X morpheme. And I highly doubt those things are super relevant to our kids, these deep linguistical debates. Um,
And
yeah.
that's kind of one of the things that when I'm working with teachers, we get into these long discussions about how a phoneme is it a phoneme or a phone, or is it two sounds or one sound or a diphthong or these things. And it's like, okay, you're the teacher, you're going to teach the kid this is the phoneme in English, right? A is kind of it's a diphthong, right? It's two sounds, but they just need to know it's A and that's what it is, and it's represented by these like these graphemes, because they gotta learn our phonemes, right? Like that's what you're teaching them. Don't
Mhm.
teach them to separate them. If they hear it, that's fine, but teach them this is what is English. This is what we do in English, and this is how it's represented. We got to keep it simple for them, um, because they got to move on. Because phonics isn't the be all and end all of reading. It's a big, big subject, and we want to get
No.
them to those next levels as soon as we can.
I kind of think phonics it's over talked about because it's so debated. And it's kind of a shame because it ends up holding more weight in conversations than it should. I think phonics is a thing that all kids need to learn and should be taught systematically. But it doesn't need to be like the a 40-minute lesson a day. In fact, and I think personally, the faster the kids learn the phonics, the faster they move on to other things. Probably the better for their literacy journeys. Um, Personally, and this is another criticism I've seen of linguistic phonics or speech printed that there's too many graphemes being taught, and that we don't necessarily need to teach 140 graphemes. That we can get them reading on based on a much smaller number of graphemes. I'll give an example. Just Jolly Phonics in one of their early scope and sequences, it only had 44 graphemes, but actually in their studies of their program, it seems to show pretty high results. Now, I'm not saying everybody go out there and follow the Jolly Phonics soap and sequence. And I've actually brought them up a lot of times and said good things about them. I have no connection with Jolly Phonics at all, like none. I once wrote an email to like someone from their company asking a question, and I never got a response. So I've never even had like a correspondence with someone from them. But I just say that to say that like a pretty simplistic code can carry kids a long way.
Yeah, that brings us back to the shares self-teaching philosophy, right? So once you kind of get to a certain point in your reading, it's like nobody's ever taught you how to read pterodactyl, but you start to figure this stuff out. So yeah, I agree. You don't have to learn all 250 graphemes. And you
There's a big
certainly don't
debate on
need.
whether or not we should teach decoding around pterodactyl, by the way. I have no personal
Is
opinion on
there?
it. I've just seen very passionate thoughts on both sides. If is PT a grapheme or
Oh
not?
dear. Yeah, I'm
Uh,
pretty sure that if there's a debate, and then yeah, um, going to Jolly Phonics. So I grew up in England on Letterland, which I know you guys have talked about before on this podcast. But there wasn't a character in Letterland for PT, so therefore I guess it's not a grapheme.
oh, there we go. Letterland is made the decision for us. Um, so are there any drawbacks in your mind to a speech to print approach? Any cautions you make? I think it's awesome that you've come at this from both approaches. That you've looked at both Orton Gillingham and speech to print, and you're able to use some flexibility in your practice and be sort of agnostic, as you said at the beginning of this episode. Is there anything that gives you pause or things you don't follow as an orthodoxy in the speech to print approach?
Um, Other than what I said, where I would really be careful on the program that I was using, because some of them I think do go they're too complicated. They're just too linguistics based, and they can be a bit much. So if you find a good program, use it. But you also have to watch the kids, right? Like it comes from you're always taking the feedback from the kids. And if you're working with a kid and you're going, or a class of kids and you're going, this is not the program for them. I think they need the regular like um speech to print to speech phonics, then pivot. You gotta do what the kids need. That's the first piece. I've used it with a wide range of kids and it's gone well. I was really hesitant to start with because I was having kind of been indoctrinated into the OG system of you can only teach one phoneme at a or one grapheme at a time. I was like, well, I just can't. And it probably took me 6 months um, before I was willing to give it a try. Um, and I tried it with a kid who was really struggling. Um, and I kind of was tearing my hair out, really, really wanted to find something that would work for him. And it was a bit of a Hail Mary pass. And it worked. I was like, okay, then I guess we will continue.
That's
So
great.
yeah.
Yeah, I'm actually really, I don't even think I'd say on this podcast what's the highest number of graphemes I've taught in a week to a student who's struggling. Because I think it would actually anger people. There would be practitioners out there be like, how dare you teach such a high number? They think it was ridiculous. Um, yeah, I love that you brought that up. And I love that you brought this thing up of an orthodoxy. I heard Steve Dykstra talk about this idea on the literacy view of that we need to avoid creating orthodoxies, and that was a big problem in balanced literacy. It was there that it was this orthodoxy, almost like a religious philosophy, and you hear it still to this day when you talk to some people who are reading recovery fans. They talk about this with Mary Clay with this level of reverence. Um, I don't want to see any scholars talked about to that degree. I have favorite scholars, and I don't hide that, but sometimes disagree with them. Uh, Dr. Steve Shannon or Steve Shannon. Um, why can't I think of his first name now? It's not Steve. Timothy, sorry, Dr. Timothy
Yeah.
Shanahan. I've on many occasions said that I think he's probably the leader in this space. Um, and then I'm working on my new book right now. I wrote down I see him as an authority on the topic of literacy, but I definitely occasionally disagree with things he says. Um, and I don't make a big stink out of it either because he's far more qualified and intelligent than me, knows tons, and there's a good chance I'm wrong. But I think we got to be open to the idea that people are wrong and that we don't need to live our literacy instruction based off like a moral code. If that makes sense.
Well, I mean, that's sticking with the science base, right? Like always being willing to pivot based on what the science is telling us, not what we believe in our hearts. I just came through a master's program, which is heavily embedded in balanced literacy, and I had some great debates with my professors. Um, and I come out of my lecture as red in the face, steam coming out of my ears and just loving it because I felt like balanced literacy isn't necessarily wrong 100% of the time. Like there's a lot of really good stuff there. And once kids are, reading in middle school area, there's a ton of comprehension and all of that stuff there's a huge amount of wealth there, and we need to not throw it away because it's been tarnished by the name balanced literacy. We need to find what works and embrace it and sift it all together into evidence-based reading instruction.
Yeah,
At
I
the
agree.
end of my master's program, one of my most balanced literacy professors came up to me and she said, "Thank you. I've enjoyed working with you over the last couple years." And I just about fell over because I was like, there's no but that's what you want, right? You want to be able to have those respectful debates
Yeah, I
and
agree.
have people listen.
That rings so clearly true for my experience when I went to school. I don't have a master's degree, but all of my professors had seen like for education, the tasks were like read the story and then tell us how you feel about it. And we didn't get any research. There was never real research presented to us for the most part. It was always just case studies and feelings. And it was taught as if the goal of Teachers College was to find our moral philosophy for which we were going to go out and become teachers, and not as in they were going to provide us an overview of research on the topic of education. Because I think at the end of the day, and this might be one of the big differences between balanced literacy and the science reading movement, I think they viewed it as an art. I think they viewed teaching as an art form. And I don't even know if they were really considering the idea that it could be a science. And, Christopher Such just talked about this a little bit, but obviously there might be a bit of both
Yeah.
behind teaching. But obviously I'm also more on the science side than the art side. But
But I think but I'd say you're in the middle because you're telling me you want to be able to pivot. You want to not be stuck to a script. You want to be able to go with the kid, right? And I
yeah.
think that's the art of it, like
Mhm.
start with the science and then the art comes in on making it, pulling it all together and following what the kids need. That's the hard bit. When you're trying to teach someone how to do this stuff, that's the really hard bit is teaching them how to pivot.
Wow. Well, this has been a fantastic conversation, and I think we both said tons of controversial things, and my DMs are going to be lit up with angry people, if not my comment sections.
I
I'm
think I'm
sorry,
just
everyone.
about to get kicked out of OG Canada as well.
Yeah. For the record, I do want to make this caveat that, as long as I think you're following or you're teaching systematic phonics to your students, it doesn't really matter if you're using a speech to print approach or an OG approach. And I think as long as you're open-minded to changing your mind on new issues and new research issues, I think that's great. Um, I think it's only that when we get too sure of ourselves or too interested in a dogmatic viewpoint that it becomes problematic. And I think, Nicola, you've done an amazing job talking about that and sharing your personal insights. And I can't think of a better person than the person who used to be the chair of OG Canada and now someone who's teaching through a speech to print approach or a bit of both, as you put it, a fusion style. So it's been a real pleasure to have you on this podcast. If people want to find out more about you, where can they contact you? And do you have anything you'd like to promote before you come off the podcast?
Well, I have a website called the Canadian Academic Interventionists Hub, so CAI Hub, and I'm trying to create a community of Canadian educators who want to have conversations about the science of reading, and evidence-based practices, MTSS, and all those good things. So people can connect with me there, connect with me on LinkedIn, Nicola Lott. I'm pretty easy to find there. Yeah, I'd love to know more Canadians who are um, in this field and passionate about science of reading like me.
That's great. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.